Aloha, my name is Dyson, and I live on Oahu, just miles from where the attack happened in 1941. I'm standing on this pier right next to the mighty Mo, where World War II officially came to an end. Joining me today is Kate Fitzgerald, who will be sharing more about the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Thanks, Dyson. My name is Kate Fitzgerald, and I'm a museum educator at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. But I'm here in Hawaii to help Dyson tell the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor and World War II. And in fact, in 3rd grade, I moved just down the street, right over there on Ford Island. And so today, we're going to be exploring sites all over Oahu that are connected to the attack and ultimately World War II.
So, let's explore the path to Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Welcome to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Today we are broadcasting live from the Hall of Democracy on the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We are pleased to have you join us from your school to discover the history behind why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. My name is Jasmine and I am a student host for the museum. Today, the story will be brought to you by 2 new student reporters, Charlie, stationed right here in New Orleans, and Dyson in Honolulu, Hawaii. They will each share what they learned on their mission to understand why Pearl Harbor was attacked and why it pushed America into the Second World War. But before we do that, remember, this program is designed to be interactive. If you're watching on the museum's website or Vimeo, you can ask questions and answer polls in the box directly next to the screen. You can also tweet us questions by using the hashtag Pearl80. You won't just be watching, but you can participate in the discussion, including asking questions live to museum curator Corey Graff. Now, let's turn to our student reporter, Dyson, in his home state of Hawaii, to learn more about the island's history the attack took place on. But first, let's open up the first poll question. True or false? The islands of Hawaii are still being shaped by shifts of its tectonic plates. Vote now and the answer will be revealed when we come back. Now, take it away, Dyson.
We're gonna kick off our trek on the path to Pearl Harbor when the place that I live in was known as the Kingdom of Hawaii. Over 2,000 miles from the US mainland, Hawaii is the most isolated island chain in the world. It consists of 8 main islands of Niihau, Kauai, Oahu, Molokai, Lanai, Kaho'olawe, Maui, and Hawaii, and many smaller islands. The Hawaiian Islands were formed by underwater volcanoes and are still being shaped by the Pacific tectonic plate today. With more than 25,000 unique species of plants and animals, Hawaii is one of the most biologically diverse places in the world. The Hawaiian Islands were settled over 1,500 years ago by voyagers from Polynesia. These people sailed across the Pacific using only the stars to guide them.
Then, in 1795, a warrior chief named Kamehameha united all of the islands under one rule, and his family dynasty reigned over Hawaii from 1795 to 1874. Around 1820, the first Christian missionaries came to Hawaii, and soon after, the first sugar plantation opened in 1835. Agriculture quickly became a dominant economic force, which led many people to move to the islands for Hawaii's prime farming land. At the same time, the missionaries and sugar plantation owners became some of the most politically and economically influential individuals in Hawaii, challenging Native Hawaiian ways of life and power, while paving the way for American annexation or control in the late 1800s.
Right now, Kate is at one of those sugar mills on the other side of the island. Let's go see what she's learning there about Hawaii's history.
I'm standing here at the Kualoa sugar mill ruins at Kuloa Ranch. In 1863, Charles Judd and his brother-in-law built the first ever sugar mill on the island of Oahu using the latest modern technology of the time. Although only in operation until 1871, it would be the first of many sugar mills across the island. Starting in the 1850s, Hawaii's agricultural production was on the rise and more labor on the islands was needed. The first workers came from China, but sugarcane plantation workers then started to make their way to the Hawaiian Islands from Japan, Korea, Portugal, and the Philippines. The population of Hawaii quickly became a rich, culturally diverse mix of immigrant workers, Native Hawaiians, and settlers from the US mainland. By the time World War II started, Hawaii's Japanese population was more than 1/3 of the total population. Now that we've learned a little about Hawaii's history and its diverse population, let's head back to the National World War II Museum, where we will learn more about the roots of the attack.
Thanks, Kate. I'm Charlie. I'm a student here at Holy Cross in New Orleans, and I'm with Dr. Stephanie Hennerschitz, who's going to tell us more about why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Great, thank you, Charlie, for being here today. These polls behind me give a little bit of information about the United States' views on the growing war in Europe. And most Americans really weren't interested in having anything to do with a war with countries that were an ocean away. However, what most Americans overlooked was the fact that there was a war already growing in Asia and the Pacific, which is where America's colonial possessions like the Philippines existed, so that the United States could get different resources and have access to markets. Now, during the 19th century, as Japan started to industrialize, Japan's going to follow America's lead and start to expand in the Pacific and in Asia as well. This is going to be a little bit of an issue when Japan looks to expand into China. And once Japan does that, it's going to put Japan on a collision course with the United States.
So why China in particular?
Great question. So Japan and the United States were kind of constantly competing for resources like raw materials and access to markets in China. So they both had established interests in China. And it really worked out okay. There wasn't any direct conflict for quite some time until 1931, when Japan's going to make a very decisive move to try and build its empire. It's going to invade Manchuria, which is this very resource-rich area of northern China. And once it does, it sets up a puppet government, Manchukuo. And the United States will refuse to recognize this government, which was basically forced upon China by Japan under the Stimson Doctrine.
Oh yeah, I learned about the Stimson Doctrine in my class at Holy Cross.
Great.
The unsuccessful Stimson Doctrine guided U.S. policy in Asia for the next decade. On one hand, the doctrine stood in support of Chinese sovereignty and against an increasingly aggressive Japanese government. On the other hand, however, it failed to bolster that position with either real consequences for Japan or meaningful support for China. U.S. companies continued to supply Japan with steel and petroleum needed to fight against China long after the conflict between the countries escalated into full-scale war in 1937. But the isolationist movement in the U.S. made many Americans believe that the nation had no business at all in international conflicts.
Exactly, Charlie. So these polls that I pointed out earlier, they really break down that growing and that strong isolationist movement. So these are both from 1940, January 1940, and then in June 1940. And they're broken down into two pretty distinct questions. So should the United States declare war on Germany and Italy? And then down here, should the United States risk going to war to help the United Kingdom? So these help to show you just how strong the isolationist movement was in the United States, even as late as 1940, and we're kind of inching closer to when the U.S. will enter the war.
Okay, so I see how isolationism prevented the U.S. from getting involved when Japan attacked Manchuria, but what does this have to do with Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, it's where I was going to go next, actually. So the isolationist movement in the United States is so strong, it's really going to direct the way the U.S. will respond to the war in Europe. So by the end of 1940, Nazi Germany has controlled France, Central Europe, North Africa, and it has its sights on Great Britain. So once Great Britain is threatened, the United States is going to shift its focus from the Pacific over to Europe. So it's not going to be really looking to intervene after Japan invades Manchuria. Instead, in 1939, the United States is going to start to ship some war materials over to Great Britain, but it really Wasn't until 1941 when the isolationist movement will start to let up a little bit, and in 1941 when we can start sending more goods over to Europe.
1941, that's the year Pearl Harbor was attacked.
That's the one. So you can often think of like what's going on in the world is like this pot that's heating up, and it's going to get closer to a boil that year. So why did the war in Europe have anything to do with Japan? Germany's military successes in the late 30s and early 40s unsettled the other European nations' Asian colonies. Japan then seized the opportunity to become the leading power in Asia by taking over some of those former European colonies. When that happened, the diplomatic relation between the United States and Japan fell apart, and the tensions between the two countries rose.
Yeah, I can almost feel the tensions rising as we speak about it right now in the museum.
Right.
Thanks, Steph. Now we're going to go over to our other reporter at the museum right now.
Thanks for the insight into what was going on worldwide and in Hawaii in the years leading up to the attack. But before we toss it back to Dyson, let's reveal the answer to the first poll question. True or false, the islands of Hawaii are still being shaped by shifts of its tectonic plates? The answer is true. The islands of Hawaii are still being shaped by shifts of its tectonic plate called the Pacific Plate. This causes magma to gush out of volcanoes as lava, like the recent eruptions on the Big Islands of Hawaii's volcano, Kilauea. Joining us now is Corey Graff. He is the curator here at the National WWII Museum. And Corey is here to show us some artifacts from the museum's vault and to answer your questions. Thanks for being with us, Corey.
You bet. Being a curator is like one of the coolest jobs in the world. There's about 5 of us here at the National WWII Museum, and every day we get to work with artifacts and we get to help build exhibits. It's a great job for somebody who wants to learn because you learn something new every day. And I brought some things here today. You want to see the first one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Okay, so this is an international signal flag. This is a flag. Various flags, collections of them, were used on the US naval ships. In fact, they were used on all ships at the time. It allowed them to communicate visually without knowing each other's language, or if a radio broke, etc. And so each one of these flags signifies a letter. So this is E, or what they call Echo today. And back in World War II, it was called Easy. But the red and blue panels means E. And you could spell out short messages with these flags. As well, each flag on its own had a meaning. It's a little bit like an emoji. It has a meaning on its own. So if you flew Echo, that meant I'm turning to the right or to the starboard. And I'll show you another one. It's got a different message. Okay, so this is Mike, or M. And you can tell it's totally different, so you can see it from very far away and know the difference. And Mike meant I'm stopped dead in the water. So these were used either to discuss the ship that they were on, or sometimes they were actually even used to talk to other ships. Uniform, or uncle is what it was in World War II, meant you're running into danger. So you could actually talk to other ships using just flags.
Wow,
Yeah.
That is so innovative. And I really like how you related these flags to like emojis. It's like a quick little status update.
That's right,
That's
exactly.
cool.
They can talk to each other that way.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that artifact from the museum. And by the way, how many of these attack on Pearl Harbor artifacts does the museum have overall?
We've got about 250,000 artifacts in total, and we're collecting all the time. Now, Pearl Harbor happened really early on, and it's kind of rare for us to get Pearl Harbor artifacts, but we do have quite a few. They are in different places in the museum. We've got some in the Arsenal of Democracy. We've got some in our Road to Tokyo exhibit. And right now we've got a temporary exhibit called Infamy that's all about Pearl Harbor. So there's artifacts all over the place.
Awesome. So I noticed that you have these gloves on. What are they for?
You like it? It's kind of a cool fashion statement, don't you think?
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. No, actually these gloves, so one of our goals here at the National WWII Museum is to make the artifacts last as long as we can. And so human hands have sweat and acid and moisture in them, And that doesn't necessarily go too well with the artifacts, especially when you handle something over many, many years. So these are to keep all my gooiness off of the artifacts and have them last forever.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll uncover more of these Pearl Harbor artifacts later on in the broadcast. Now let's turn to some student questions. And let's see, we have one coming in. Okay, this one is from Jojo. Jojo says, what's your favorite in the collection?
My favorite artifact in the collection, it's really hard to pick because there are hundreds, there are thousands of artifacts. But I must say that one of my favorite things, I've always been a plane guy, I always liked airplanes, and we have a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that's actually from the hometown. It was built in my hometown of Seattle, Washington, and that airplane, big 4-engine heavy bomber, and they were used all over the world. In fact, you may even see the B-17 come up in some of our presentation today.
Okay.
But this particular one, it didn't make it. It was getting flown to England and crashed in the snow, and they brought it back, restored it to the way it looked the day it was flying, and it hangs in our Freedom Pavilion. And
Wow.
It's very cool.
That sounds cool. All right, let's open up the next poll question. Which Hawaiian island has one of the best harbors vital to the Pacific? A, the Forbidden Isle, Niihau. B, the Big Island, Hawaii. C, the Pineapple Island, Lanai. Or D, the Gathering Place, Oahu. Vote now and stay tuned for the answer. And don't forget to use the hashtag Pearl80 to ask us questions or let us know you're watching. Now, we will head back to Honolulu to learn more about Hawaii and why Pearl Harbor was attacked. Take it away, Dyson.
Here we are today at Iolani Palace, and I'm here with Palace historian Zita, but today I'll be referring to her as Auntie Zita. Now, the reason for this is because here in Hawaii, we refer to our kupuna, our elders, as auntie or uncle. So, Auntie Zita, thank you so much for having me today.
Mahalo for coming.
So, one of the questions that I have when I think about Iolani Palace is, why is it called Iolani Palace? Did kings or queens live here?
Kings and queens certainly did work here, entertain here. What most people don't realize is that before Hawaii became part of the United States, we were an internationally recognized sovereign nation with a royal family. King Kalakaua had the palace built. He and his wife, Queen Kapi'olani, welcomed guests and visitors from all around the globe.
Why didn't the Hawaiian monarchy stay in power?
The Hawaiian monarchy became a constitutional monarchy about 50 years before the overthrow. A lot of it had to do with voting rights and executive privilege. The 1887 Constitution replaced citizenship with residency, and there were literacy tests.
So does that mean that King Kalakaua was the last king? And I mean, what about the overthrow?
King Kalakaua had the palace built. He reigned until his death in 1891. He was succeeded by his sister, Liliuokalani. She was requested, like her brother was, by great groups in the community. They wanted a new constitution. They wanted to return citizenship as a voting requirement. They wanted to do tests in all the languages that were spoken in the community. So you didn't just have to speak English or Hawaiian to be able to vote. You could speak any of the languages. And a small group of primarily small businessmen and lawyers, most of American ancestry, decided this was not in the best interests of the nation. So they deposed Liliuokalani and overthrew the monarchy.
I see. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. This palace is really beautiful, and I mean, as you shared, there's a lot of very deep history, both for Hawaiians and then for Americans as well, embedded within this palace. So, mahalo for your time, Auntie.
Mahalo for coming.
We'll check back later to hear more about how Iolani Palace was used during World War II. By 1900, Hawaii was not the only territory the US had in the Pacific.
America's overseas expansion included Alaska, Johnston, Palmyra, Midway, Wake, Guam, the Philippines, and Samoa. When the Japanese started to expand their empire in the 1930s, they moved closer to many of America's interests in the Pacific. By the end of the 1930s, the Japanese Imperial Navy had a force more extensive than the United States in the Pacific. Now, let's head on over to the US Army Museum of Hawaii at Fort DeRussy to learn more about the buildup of the US military in Hawaii. The museum is housed inside Battery Randolph, a former coastal artillery fortification on the famous Waikiki Beach. I'm here with Dr. William Chapman, a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So we've learned so far about Hawaii becoming a territory of the United States and how tensions were rising between Japan and the United States. So, Dr. Chapman, how did these rising tensions affect Hawaii?
Hawaii was really notably at the forefront of what the U.S. saw happening in the Pacific, of course. And I think it's a kind of misunderstanding that the U.S. was completely caught off guard at the time of Pearl Harbor, because we had actually been moving in many ways toward preparations for a possible war with Japan. The draft had been instituted in November 1940. People were being trained all over the country. Hundreds of new bases were growing up. Hawaii, of course, would play a big part in that. So it was kind of an extension of what went on in the mainland. So the whole population of Hawaii was about a third of what it is now, about 422,000 as of 1940. Within the next year, there was an increase of about 12,000 civilians. These were people that were brought in to actually work on military fortifications. It was very hard in Hawaii because all these civilian workers suddenly showed up and they didn't really have places to stay or things to do. And so that was sort of really, I think, the first wave of the realization that something was happening.
So in that case, how many ships and sailors were stationed here?
Actually, 1941, in February, they actually made the decision that they were going to consolidate the fleet operations in the Pacific and moved the entire Pacific fleet. So they moved 3 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 12 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 destroyers, and 33 submarines.
While Pearl Harbor and the other military bases on Oahu were being expanded, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a move in July 1940 that escalated the tension with Japan when he cut off scrap iron, steel, and aviation fuel to Japan, even as he allowed American oil to continue flowing to the empire. Meanwhile, in Europe, Nazi Germany was expanding its borders on all sides, pushing France to surrender in 1940. The government of Nazi-occupied France gave permission for Japan to expand into French Indochina, confirming Japan's alliance with Germany and Italy as a member of the Axis powers. In July 1941, Japan moved into southern Indochina to prepare for an attack against British Malaya, a source for rice, rubber, tin, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. This move prompted Roosevelt to freeze all Japanese assets in the United States on July 26, 1941, cutting off Japan's access to US oil. Let's turn this over to Kate at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam to share more about how oil fits into this story.
Hey everyone, I'm here on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam with Commander Daryl Frame, who's going to tell us a little bit more about Red Hill. We're standing here in front of this beautiful fountain. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. So this fountain was dedicated to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that lost their life during the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor.
You mentioned Red Hill, but what is Red Hill?
So Red Hill is the Department of Defense's largest fuel supply center in the world.
Wow.
Yeah. So Red Hill consists of 20 underground storage tanks. This is a model we have of our underground storage tanks. So this should be 100 feet across and 250 feet tall. So just to put that in perspective, if you took the wings off a 747, put the tail down here and the nose up here, you could stand up on the end inside one of our storage tanks.
Wow, that is really big.
Yeah.
So why was fuel storage so important for the military?
So, you know, here in the Pacific, we have this phrase we use called the tyranny of distance. So the Pacific theater is really, really large, and there's not a lot of land. It's mostly water, right? So in order for ships and aircraft to move across that entire Pacific theater, we have to have fuel, and we have to have a lot of it. So that's why fuel is so important to Hawaii. In the late 1930s, the Navy started to sense some hostile intentions with Japan, and we thought we can't keep our fuel storage tanks above ground. Coupled with the fact that those tanks right now, even with those 50 tanks, we didn't have enough storage.
Right.
So we started looking at different alternatives to storing fuel, and that's where the whole concept of Red Hill came into play. So December 7th, 1941, we still have all those tanks circumventing Pearl Harbor, right? So earlier, prior to building Red Hill, they looked at those tanks and said, you know, all it's going to take is a 50 cal bullet and a spark, and our whole fuel supply goes up in smoke. So Red Hill, fortunately, someone at that time had the foresight to build Red Hill in advance of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Commander Frame, I want to thank you for inviting us to Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam and telling us more about Red Hill and fuel in the military.
Japan refused to give back any of its newly acquired lands. The United States insisted that Japan immediately withdraw its troops from China and Indochina. While diplomatic talks continued between the United States and Japan, neither side budged.
The path to Pearl Harbor is a little clearer now, but I still have a few more questions. Before we head over to the actual site of the attack on Oahu, let's go to the National WWII Museum, where Jasmine has another Pearl Harbor artifact to show us.
Thanks, Dyson and Dr. Chapman. We're back at the National World War II Museum with Curator Corey to take a closer look at another artifact. But first, let's reveal the answer to the second poll question. Which Hawaiian island has one of the best harbors vital to the Pacific? The answer is D, the gathering place, Oahu. Pearl Harbor on Oahu is located near the center of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,500 miles from California and about 4,000 miles from Japan. Now, Corey, we just learned about how Hawaii became a territory of the U.S. and how tensions between Japan and America led to the U.S. military building on Oahu. It looks like we're beginning to understand the answer to why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It was to protect their growing empire from Western and in particular United States interference. So what do these artifacts here have to do with our mission to learn more about the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor?
Jasmine, let me grab another piece of the museum's collection here. So this is a K-Pack life jacket. This is the kind of thing a sailor would have worn at Pearl Harbor. But the interesting thing about the attack is this is the type of life jacket they would use at battle stations in combat, not so much on a Sunday morning in port. And so we don't see as many of these in photographs as we might imagine. The life jacket is kind of cool in and of itself. It's stuffed with a natural tropical fiber. It's a little bit like cotton. It's called K-Pack. And it floats, which is a great thing for a combat life jacket, because if you imagine having puffy air bladders, if there's metal and bullets flying around, you get your air bladder punctured. But this works, it floats regardless of whether it's damaged or not. Originally, these were made before World War II in bright colors like oranges and yellows, so you could see somebody in the water. As the US slipped into a war footing, they actually started making them blue, so they're sort of camouflaged, they blend in. And Interestingly enough, these were used by sailors at the time in the US Navy, but also the pilots that were attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese pilots, they also had K-Pack life jackets. They were a little different. They were not as puffy because they had to wear them in the cockpit, but both nations were using the same technology during that early part of the war.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so cool. And that is it's so smart that they chose to use, how do you pronounce it?
K-Pack.
K-Pack.
Yeah.
That they use K-Pack instead of like an inflatable material.
Yep.
Because that can get punctured by like the bullets and things.
That's right.
So,
That's
wow.
right. The way these worked is, since it was a natural fiber, you would be able to use it. It was buoyant for a couple of days, but if you were in the water in a shipwreck for more than a couple of days, it would actually get waterlogged and wouldn't work anymore and would get heavy and sink. So you had to take it off and abandon your life jacket at that point.
Oh man, wow. So much respect to those soldiers who were prepared to do that. Being a museum curator looks like a really cool career path.
It is. It's really interesting, and it's quite a fun job. You just get to deal with material like this every day. People donate material, and you learn something new all the time. You can't tell what's going to come in the door, and if you like to learn and you like history, it's a great job to have.
Awesome. Well, let's take a look at some student questions. Cool. All right, we have one coming in from Mrs. Gorman Pullen's class. And they ask, why did the US have most of its fleet all in one place?
That's a great question. Okay, so we saw a little of this in the segment before. The US fleet's main battle fleet was in California, but as tensions started to escalate with the Japanese, they were actually moved out to a location off the coast, 2,500 miles, to Hawaii, so that they would be closer, they would have access quicker to the Pacific. Now, why all in one place? There's really only one really good port, deep water port in the Hawaiian Islands, and that's on Oahu. So that was the place that they were forced to have all the ships in one area, all their combat ships for the Pacific at the time. There's also a practicality aspect to it of it's good to have all the ships, all the supplies, the fuel that was talked about in the presentation, housing, equipment, all in one place. Now, the US thought that Hawaii was sort of outside of the sphere of Japanese attack in 1941, and so it seemed like a safe move at the time, but obviously things didn't go as planned.
Ah, I see. Well, let's go ahead and open up our next poll question. What was the first ship to anchor on Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor? A, the USS Arizona, B, the USS California, C, the USS Oklahoma, and D, the USS West Virginia. And we have one more poll question. Let's see. Oh, okay. We will reveal the answer to the poll question after the next segment. And now let's see if Dyson has made his way yet to Pearl Harbor.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Hawaii. So far, we are at November of 1941 in our quest to understand why Pearl Harbor was attacked.
On November 26, 1941, as US officials presented the Japanese with a 10-point statement reiterating their long-standing position, the Japanese Imperial Navy ordered an armada that included 414 planes aboard 6 aircraft carriers set to sea. The plan aimed to destroy the US Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor. To catch the Americans by surprise, the ships maintained strict radio silence throughout their 3,500-mile trek from Hitokapu Bay to a predetermined spot 230 miles north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. At 6 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, the first wave of Japanese planes lifted off from the carriers, followed by a second wave an hour later. Just before 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes carrying bombs and torpedoes attacked the Pearl Harbor Naval Station and surrounding military bases. For nearly 2 hours, Japanese firepower rained down upon American ships and service members.
I'm here at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. Here with Park Ranger Alex, we'll be sharing more about those who were actually at the attack that day. So, thank you so much.
Welcome. Right behind us is the USS Arizona Memorial. A lot of the focus takes place on the Arizona because the Arizona doesn't just represent the largest loss of life here at Pearl Harbor, but in U.S. naval history. No other single ship had lost as many sailors. But there were over 21 ships that were either significantly damaged or sank here at Pearl Harbor. And the second highest casualty rate came from the USS Oklahoma. She went down with 429 sailors.
Another question that I have is, was it just the ships and sailors here that were attacked? Were there attacks all around the island?
Yes, there were attacks throughout the island. There were 5 airfields that were also targeted around the island, starting up at Hickam Airfield, Wheeler Airfield, Kaneohe, and Eva Mooring Mast. And these all were controlled by the Army Air Forces or the Marine Corps.
Okay, I see. Well, speaking of Air Forces, I think we should go to another site of the attack called Ford Island right over here. And now I'm here at Hangar 79, which the Japanese planes attacked on that fateful December 7th. I'm here with museum educator Ford Ebesugawa with the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. So Ford, thank you so much for taking the time to invite me here.
Dyson, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. So, Ford, I have a really interesting question here, which is, how did Ford Island factor into the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted 2-wave attack on that December 7th morning. The first wave consisted of about 183 aircraft, and it struck Ford Island at 7:55 on that December 7th morning. The second wave arrived with about 170 aircraft about an hour later. So the entire attack itself took less than 2 hours.
And then, we've heard before how kind of, Americans and Hawaiians over here woke up to the sounds of the Japanese planes coming in. Were they able to shoot down any of the Japanese planes?
Surprisingly, the American response to the Japanese attack on that December 7th morning was almost immediate. The gun crews and fighter pilots, they're credited with shooting down 29 Japanese aircraft that morning. There was a sailor on board the West Virginia. His name was Doris Miller, and he was a ship's cook aboard that battleship. And on that December 7th morning, his battle station was an anti-aircraft battery that was damaged by a torpedo. So he began assisting his wounded fellow crew members by carrying them to safety. He also aided his mortally wounded captain of the ship. And with no training at all, Dory manned a 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun and fired that until the ammunition ran out, and he was ordered to abandon ship. And for his role in Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller was awarded the Navy's second highest medal, called the Navy Cross, and he was the first African American to be awarded that medal.
With over 3,600 military casualties and as many as 100 civilian deaths and injuries, the attack on Pearl Harbor represented the largest assault by an outside power on a US military position in the country's history. But the Japanese also immediately followed their Pearl Harbor assault with attacks against US and British bases in the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, Wake Island, Malaya, and Hong Kong. Within days, the Japanese were masters of the Pacific.
So the war finally came to America's doorstep.
In that case, I mean, the Japanese attack, did it destroy all of the American, military assets and bases?
Well, even though the attack itself was devastatingly destructive, because Japan didn't follow up with attacks on the ship repair facilities, our dry docks, and our fuel storage tanks, it mitigated that attack.
I see. That's a stroke of luck for the American military
Most
forces.
definitely. Yes.
I see. So what the Japanese military force did manage to destroy, such as the battleships and the aircraft, what did the United States do with all those destroyed materials afterwards?
Well, because our ship repair facilities was still in operation, of the 21 ships that were damaged or destroyed, all of them were put back into service for the war effort, with the exception of the battleships Utah, Oklahoma, and of course the Arizona.
Almost immediately after the attack, the US military began rescue and salvage operations. General Short, overruling Hawaii's territorial governor Joseph Poindexter, declared martial law in Hawaii. Fearing a Japanese invasion by land, General Short ordered the troops occupy coastal positions around Oahu. Troops placed barriers and barbed wire along beaches and dug trenches at defensive positions. General Short also ordered ROTC units at the university and local high schools to report for duty as part of the Hawaiian Territorial Guard. But in January of 1942, cadets of Japanese ancestry were discharged from the units without explanation. The discharge was caused by the baseless fears that their loyalty were still with their ancestral country of Japan. The Nisei students sent a petition to the military governor of Hawaii and said, "Hawaii is our home. The United States is our country. We know but one loyalty, and that is to the Stars and Stripes." Their petition worked, and they were organized as a Varsity Victory Volunteers group, working for the Army as construction workers. Eventually, many of those same students served with the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, which were all Japanese-American segregated units. The military also took over many government buildings, including Iolani Palace. Many of the Nisei cadets stood watch there. Hawaii's home front, like many other towns and cities across America, also responded to the challenge of war preparation. School-aged children dug trenches, shop owners taped display windows, and plantation workers removed military debris from sugar fields. There were also victory gardens, and war bond, and scrapping drives. Property owners were required to provide bomb shelters. Around 250 public shelters were scattered throughout Honolulu.
Thanks to all these historical sites for sharing their knowledge and how the attack impacted them. Now we'll be going over to the National World War II Museum's America Responds Gallery to learn more about how that attack impacted the rest of the US.
At the White House, Roosevelt learned of the attack as he finished lunch and prepared to attend his stamp collection. He spent the remainder of the afternoon receiving updates and writing the address he intended to deliver to Congress the following day on December 8th, asking for a declaration of war against Japan. As he drafted and redrafted the speech, Roosevelt focused on rallying the nation behind a war that many had hoped to avoid.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The declaration passed with just one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, allied with Japan, declared war on the US. America was now drawn into a global war. It had allies in this fight, most notably Great Britain and the Soviet Union, but the job the nation faced in December 1941 was formidable. We're in the America Responds Gallery, and Senior Curator Tom Chikansky is going to show us around a little bit.
Charlie, it's great to have you here today. As you know, America was deeply divided before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but after the attack, they came together and everyone joined forces to make sure that this war would be a victory for us. One of the things they did in July, the National Publishers Association, July 1942, got together and they said, we're going to put an American flag on the cover of every magazine in America. And this newsstand represents that idea. Over 500 magazines put the American flag out there. They wanted to show that magazines could support the war effort and that the country was all behind this war. As a result, they were able to maintain their publications through the war, getting an allotment for paper and ink and helping in the war effort. Another thing that they did during the war was ration material. Metal and rubber were hard to come by and being used for other things. And so manufacturers came up with alternatives. And those products collectively became known as victory items. One example is this washboard. You know, washboards usually have a metal board in the center to wash your clothes on. But this company was able to manufacture one all of wood, and they called it a victory washboard, and it became not just a washboard you could use, but a symbol that you were supporting the war effort by buying victory things. Another example of this is pencils. Pencils had the little metal tip on the end with a rubber eraser. Well, the rubber and the metal were both rationed, so you got a pencil with no eraser at all, and that was a victory pencil.
No mistakes on that one.
That's it. Just move on. Another thing that young people like yourself did was participate in scrap drives. And we have our small exhibit of scrap here in the corner that shows what students would go out and collect. And they'd collect metal and rubber tires and all manner of things that were used and left over, ask their neighbors to save their empty cans for them, and take all these things to collection centers, not unlike recycling today. You might go to your neighbor, and if they had 4 aluminum pots, you'd ask them if they could get by with 1. And you could take those other 3 and turn them in, and they could be made into things like airplanes.
Thanks for showing us around, Tom. It really seems like the whole country is impacted by the war effort. Speaking of the whole country, let's see if we have any questions coming around from around the nation.
We have lots of questions coming in from students all over. But before we answer a few of them, let's take a look at the answer to the poll question. What was the first ship to anchor on Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor? The answer is B, the USS California. In 1911, the USS California, carrying dignitaries, including Sanford Dole and Queen Liliuokalani, was the first major warship to enter Pearl Harbor. Now that we've answered the poll question, let's take a look at our last artifact and answer a few more students' questions.
So Jasmine, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the territory of Hawaii seemed like it was in the balance, like the Japanese might invade any day. So what that meant was all of the beaches got barbed wire so that they couldn't be approached from the sea. There were gun emplacements, people dug trenches, the curtains, blackout curtains went up so that Hawaii couldn't be seen from the air by scouting airplanes. So there was a real expectation that there was going to be an attack. And civilians in Hawaii started walking around with a case like this. Do you have any idea what this is?
Well, it says gas mask.
Aha, that's right. It says gas mask right on it. So let me pull you the gas mask here and we'll have a look at it. Unfortunately, these days we're quite familiar with masks at school and at work. And this is a little bit of a different one. So we have 2 parts connected by a hose. The filter is down here, the hose, rubber hose, of course. And then this is the face mask. Now, unlike the masks we wear today that cover your nose and mouth, this one covers your nose, your mouth, and your eyes. Poison gas, which had been used in World War I, sometimes designed to irritate or hurt your eyes as well as your lungs. And so everyone would walk around with these, because if poison gas was deployed by the Japanese, you'd have to have access to one of these in minutes. And that meant even the school kids were going to school with, I don't know, this probably weighs about 10 pounds, along with their book bags. And there's writings from the time that say sailors saying some of these kids, they're almost as small as their gas mask packets that they're lugging around. So this just became part of daily life in the territory of Hawaii for quite a while. Now, of course, there was a huge military buildup after Pearl Harbor, and a lot of the locals welcomed that, because they felt like it would be very impractical for the Japanese to attack the islands proper.
Wow. I can only imagine that must have been quite stressful for the civilians to never know when they're going to be attacked and how they would be attacked.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was probably a tough time for the kids who had to lug around 3 algebra books worth of gas mask and filter.
Yeah. Well, let's check out some student questions then. Okay, there's one coming in from Ethan Minton, and Ethan asks, how does the museum collect artifacts?
Our curators get offers for artifacts every day, and it's an amazing amount, maybe 12 to 15 offers a day. And this comes from people all around the United States. It used to be veterans themselves would give the material to the museum. Nowadays, more often than not, it's the sons or daughters or grandsons or granddaughters of veterans that are able to turn the material over. So one of the things that's important to us is to not just get a canteen, but get the story behind the canteen, like where it came from, who owned it, and where it went, and what the significance of it is. So it's quite a job, and it's completely ongoing, but we have 250,000 items, and we're continuing to collect.
Wow. That's fascinating. And it looks like there's another student question. It is from Nathan from Summit Valley Middle School. And Nathan asks, were there any American planes in the air during the attack?
Yeah, there were. Actually, interestingly enough, there were some civilian planes in the air during the attack that morning. And some were flying right off of Pearl Harbor and some at other various points on the island. And Japanese fighters sort of sweeping the area actually shot some of them down. Another one that's a survivor is you can actually see at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. They have it hanging from the ceiling. The pilot actually dodged away from the Japanese fighters and got away. Wow. Now, as the attack started, some Army pilots actually were able to get into the air. The fighter of the time was the Curtiss P-40 fighter, and some pilots, a handful of them, were actually able to get in the skies and fight against these Japanese invaders. One of the more famous is George Welch. He's from the Welch grape juice family, actually.
Oh my.
And he was a flyer, sort of a hero of Pearl Harbor, and then afterwards he took a job as a test pilot for North American Aviation in California. So there were some flyers in the air. Now, I should also say, a lot of the Navy patrol planes that would actually go out and look for the carriers, the Japanese carriers after the fact, had been destroyed. So they grouped what they had left, and they actually shot them out to the south. The Japanese carriers happened to be to the north, so they never spotted the Japanese carriers as those ships retreated back towards Japan.
I see. And it looks like there is one more student question, and it is from Bruce. Bruce asks, why were the U.S. aircraft carriers out to sea?
That's a big point of the Pearl Harbor attack, is that aircraft carriers became so important. Obviously, they were super potent. We just saw these 6 Japanese aircraft carriers attack Pearl Harbor and destroy much of the fleet. So the idea that those ships, the U.S.'s aircraft carriers, were out of the harbor is a great thing for the United States. I think there were 3 that were normally based at Pearl Harbor at the time. The Saratoga was actually on the West Coast getting repaired. The other 2 carriers were actually, as tensions rose between Japan and the United States, they were shuttling aircraft and supplies to 2 islands, Wake Island and Midway Island. So that's why they weren't in port that day. Believe it or not, the Enterprise, the U.S. Enterprise, was supposed to be in port that day, but they'd run into heavy seas on their way back from north, and they actually slowed down and weren't yet in the harbor that Sunday morning.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you guys all asked some excellent questions, and don't forget that there is still time to send in your questions about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Let's now open up the final poll question. True or false? The U.S. caught the incoming first wave of Japanese planes on radar, but thought they were American planes. Vote now. Now let's turn back to Hawaii one final time to learn a bit more about what the attack sites around Oahu look like 80 years after Japan first dropped the bombs that Sunday morning.
Thanks, Jasmine. We're back with Park Ranger Alex at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial.
In 1958, just 17 years after the attack, President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved legislation to establish the USS Arizona Memorial to commemorate military personnel killed in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona Memorial was constructed over the hull of the sunken USS Arizona and dedicated by the Pacific War Memorial Commission in 1962. The USS Arizona Memorial honors the 1,177 crewmen who died as a result of the attack. The hull is both a tomb for more than 900 sailors who remain within and serves as an artificial reef, providing habitat for marine life.
For those sailors and servicemen who died here, where are their remains held?
Well, originally after the attack, they were buried all across the island. But after the war, their remains were collected, and then they placed them up at Punchbowl Cemetery, which is the veteran cemetery on the island.
Pearl Harbor National Memorial and Punchbowl are not the only places where you can see World War II history. If you look closely, all around Oahu, there are other places where this important history is kept alive.
From the Aloha Tower, which was the tallest building in Honolulu in 1941, that was painted camouflage during World War II, to the patio of the Moana Surfrider, where tourists today sit on the same grounds Allied service members sat on to relax. The U.S. military has had a perpetual presence on the island since the war. Today, visitors and locals alike can hike Diamond Head or tour Kualoa Ranch and see bunkers left over from World War II.
I'm here at Kuloa Ranch with David Morgan, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about where we are.
This is Battery Cooper, and it was built by the military during World War II. I believe it was started sometime in the beginning part of 1942 and completed sometime in 1943.
That's really cool. So they built this during World War II.
Yes, and there was 2 big 6-inch guns emplaced up here, so they're shooting bullets that are about this big around.
And they were right here?
They're right here. This one was right here, and the other one was down on that side.
Oh, wow. And so what did they use this for?
This was to repel invading fleets that were coming in.
Awesome.
Because everybody thought the Japanese were going to follow up with an invasion. And so my understanding is by the end of 1943, Oahu was the most fortified island in the whole world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you still go in it today?
Yep. Why don't we go inside?
I think we should.
So this is a blueprint of this facility, and we just entered in past gun number 1. We're standing right here right now. If you can see, if you follow it back in, this is where they stored the projectiles for the gun, and then this is where the powder magazines were. And then in the back is where the galley and the latrine and all that kind of stuff. And then the electrical generators were in this hallway here. And then this little square here was a shaft, still is there, and it goes up, and there's a series of ladders against the wall that go up to another shaft up above that goes out to the cliff face. And that's where the guy with the binoculars was that sighted in the gun.
Battery Cooper on Kuloa Ranch still stands today as a reminder to all who visit the ranch of the vital role Hawaii played in World War II.
The USS Missouri, the last battleship commissioned by the United States, is now docked near the USS Arizona Memorial, providing a sense of closure to Ford Island and Battleship Row.
Thank you so much for showing me around the Mighty Mo, Frank. Really appreciate it. So, one of the things that I'm wondering when I'm looking at the USS Missouri is what sort of role did this ship play in World War II?
Yeah, well, the USS Missouri came in towards the latter end of World War II. She was launched in January of 1944, and she only saw the tail end of World War II, and she served exclusively in the Pacific Theater. In the battles of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then she served as the venue for the surrender ceremony that brought World War II to an end.
And I mean, the place that the surrender took place is right over here, and that's crazy to think about that World War II basically ended on the decks of the ship. Can you share more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So, September 2nd, 1945, the Battleship Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay, and this location right here is an important place in world history. This is where World War II absolutely came to an end. So in Japan, an 11-man delegation was sent on behalf of the Emperor of Japan to come on board the USS Missouri to officially sign the documents, the instruments of surrender that would end World War II. So right where we're standing is where the table was, where the documents were signed. The Japanese delegation stood on the opposing side of the table, and then the Allied delegations were on this side of the table. So right where we're standing over here is where the chair where all the Allied delegates sat to sign the 2 copies of the instrument surrender. So if you look at a lot of historical photos, this is exactly where MacArthur sat to sign the documents during that ceremony.
Oh wow, that's crazy. And I mean, we look at the USS Arizona Memorial right down there and the USS Missouri over here, and it really feels like they're bookends of the war.
Yes, absolutely, yes. December 7th, 1941, the wreck of the USS Arizona embodying the beginning of World War II for the United States. And then the surrender deck on the USS Missouri representing the end of World War II, not only for the United States, but for the entire world.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Frank. This is an incredible part of history during World War II, and I think it's really incredible that the Mighty Mo is located right next to the USS Arizona Memorial. So again, thank you so much for your time, Frank. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Dyson. It's my pleasure.
I've learned so much from visiting all these historical places about the attack on Pearl Harbor on Oahu. Some residents in Hawaii had long fought for this place to become a state, but that fight was going to be put on hold after the attack.
It would be Nisei who served in the war, men like Daniel Inoue of the storied all-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team, who returned to Hawaii to pick up the call for statehood. Inoue and other Nisei veterans were elected to Congress and argued that Hawaiian residents had sacrificed and fought for the United States like every other American. Their home deserved full representation. With assistance from Democratic politicians, Hawaii became a state alongside Alaska in 1959.
World War II had a huge impact on the place that I live in, and it continues to do so 80 years later. Thank you for joining me, and I'm now going to give it off to Jasmine at the National World War II Museum, who'll be fielding some of the final student questions.
Big thank you to Dyson and Charlie for their in-depth reporting to help us better understand why Pearl Harbor was attacked and how we still remember it 80 years after it happened. Before we take one more student question, let's take a look at the answer to the last poll question. True or false? The US caught the incoming first wave of Japanese planes on radar, but thought they were American planes. The answer is true. On Sunday, December 7th, a radar operator on Oahu saw a large group of airplanes on his screen heading towards the island. He called his superior, who told him it was probably a group of US B-17 bombers who were due to arrive and not to worry about it. If you want to hear the oral story of the man who made that call, check out our website. And for one last time, let's bring in Corey to answer your questions. Let's see, there is one question coming in, and it is from Emma and Ella. And they ask, how many Pearl Harbor survivors are alive today?
So, in Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, and the surrounding area, there were thousands and thousands of people during the attack. However, media reports say that only about 75 to 100 of the people that actually survived the Pearl Harbor attacks are still alive today.
Wow, that's not a very big number.
Not a very big number
It just
at
shows
all.
how long ago it happened. So the student reporters left us with their final thoughts. What were your biggest takeaways after learning more about the attack on Pearl Harbor and why it got us involved in World War II?
Pearl Harbor is an interesting subject to study. The war in China and in Europe had been going on for years by that point that Pearl Harbor happened. And while many people look at it as a beginning, the US's entry into World War II, you can also look at it as the end. Once the United States had entered World War II, after 3.5 years of fighting, it was the end of the Axis, and the US and Great Britain were victorious.
All right. Well, thank you, Corey, for your insight and for answering some of these student questions out there. And we also want to thank all of our filming partners, including the National Park Service, Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, the Iolani Palace, USS Missouri, Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, the U.S. Army Museum at Fort Durussy, the Battleship, Missouri Memorial, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, and the Kualoa Ranch. We are signing off from the National World War II Museum. Please fill out the survey below and share with us pictures of you and your class watching with the hashtag Pearl80. Thank you for tuning in on the 80th attack, on the 80th anniversary of the attack, to learn about the path to Pearl Harbor.